To pay for cases of French wine and rare books from Europe, he didn't go to a bank. He mortgaged human lives. In 1772, he received his main asset, not land, not gold, 135 people who became his property after his marriage. They became his personal collateral. And then he made children forge money for him. 10-year-old boys in his factory produced thousands of nails a day, paying for every symbol of his enlightened life. But do you think he did it for wealth? Wealth was merely a means. He had a much grander goal. He wasn't just going to build a house. He was going to build an argument for the whole world to see. And to prove to this world the great idea of human freedom, he had to design the most perfect prison in American history for hundreds of people. We think we know this house. It floats in the morning mists of Virginia, not as a structure, but as a promise. Perfect symmetry. Snow-white columns supporting a portico, like an ancient temple. And above it all, a dome, the first on an American home, shining at dawn like the crown of reason. This is Monticello. This is America in miniature, bold, rational, looking to the future. It was here, in the quiet of a study overlooking these hills, that its creator wrote the words that changed the world. We proceed from the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. The year, 1776. The author, Thomas Jefferson. And this house was meant to be the living proof of his philosophy. Today, people come here like pilgrims to a shrine. They see genius in everything, in the ingenious gadgets, in the library that holds the wisdom of the ages, in the harmony of the lines he himself drew. They look up at that dome and see the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals. But to understand this house, you have to look down. The camera must slowly descend. Past the grand facade, past the immaculate lawns and gardens where the philosopher strolled, contemplating human rights. Down the hill, just a few hundred steps, to where the theater ends and reality begins. To here, to Mulberry Row, the tone changes. Instead of elegant architecture, crudely hewn logs. Instead of polished floors, packed earth. There are no brilliant inventions here. There are only the traces of hard, endless labor, and a silence filled with the voices of those whom history tried to forget. Peter Fawcett, James Hubbard, Ursula Granger, Sally Hemings, and more than 600 other names over the lifetime of this home's owner. And here it is, the central paradox of American history, frozen in brick and wood atop this mountain. How could the man who gave the world the most eloquent language of freedom be the master of hundreds of human lives? How could this house, this temple of reason and progress, simultaneously be a prison? Here, at Monticello, the lofty rhetoric of freedom met the daily practice of oppression. Every elegant detail upstairs was paid for by the invisible labor downstairs. Every philosophical conversation in the parlor was muffled by the clanking of chains on this street. This is not just a house. This is a crime scene. And at the same time, a monument to the greatest aspirations of the human spirit. To understand America, you have to understand this place. You have to dare to look at the shining facade and see the cracks in its foundation. Because the story of Monticello is the story of how a great dream was built on a great sin, and how they still live together under one perfectly designed roof. The American dream loves its myths of the self-made man, of the genius who built an empire from nothing through the power of his intellect and will. But Thomas Jefferson did not make himself. He inherited himself. His ambitions, his library, his exquisite taste, it all rested on 3 pillars, none of which he raised himself. The first pillar, land. From his father, he received 5,000 acres, A solid starting capital, a reliable foundation for the life of a wealthy Virginia planter. But Jefferson didn't want to be just a planter. He saw himself as an American aristocrat of the mind, and for that, he needed entirely different money. And so he made the most important deal of his life. In 1772, he married Martha Wales Skelton. This was not just a union of two hearts, it was a merger of capital. Along with Martha, he acquired 11,000 acres of land, and much more importantly, 135 people. 135 men, women, and children, who, in the accounting books of the time, were listed as the most liquid asset. Their lives, their labor, their futures, all of it became fuel for his dream. And here we come to the third, most cynical pillar of his wealth. Jefferson understood what all great financiers understand. Property is worthless if it doesn't work. And he put it to work. These people were not just a labor force. They were his collateral. When he needed money for rare books from Europe, for scientific instruments, or for cases of French wine, he didn't go to a bank. He went to his creditors and mortgaged human lives. Every volume of Voltaire in his library, every brick in the wall of his future home, was secured by the body of a living person. But the most tangible mechanism of this ruthless economy was his nail factory. There, on Mulberry Row, in the smoke and heat, boys worked, children from 10 to 16 years old. Their task was to produce thousands of nails a day. Jefferson, a man of the Enlightenment, personally designed the system. Each boy had a daily quota. In the evening, he himself, as meticulously as he recorded the weather, weighed each one's output. Fail to meet the quota, your rations are cut. Fail again, a whipping. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was ruthless efficiency. The profits from these nails, forged by the hands of children, went directly to pay the bills for the most refined symbols of civilization. Every nail hammered into boards across Virginia turned into a drop of wine in the philosopher's glass, a new page in his priceless library. He got the capital. He got the workforce. He turned people into money with chilling efficiency. But to what end? Wealth was not his ultimate goal. It was only a means. And now, standing atop his little mountain, secured by the labor and pain of others, he was ready to begin his master project. He wasn't just going to build a house. He was going to build an argument for the whole world to see. Why here? Any sensible planter would build his house in a valley, by a river, near a road, where it's convenient to live and conduct business. But Thomas Jefferson chose the top of a mountain nearly 300 meters high. A logistical nightmare. Every brick, every log, every barrel of water had to be brought up here through immense human effort. This choice, impractical, defiant, almost insane, was the first word in his architectural statement. And that word was arrogance. He wasn't just building a plantation house, he was erecting an altar, and he named it in the Italian manner, Monticello, Little Mountain. To understand this house, you have to understand what he was rejecting. The architecture of colonial America spoke one language, British, the Georgian style, rectangular, sturdy, respectable brick boxes. The architecture of order, tradition, and most importantly, the power of the metropole. Every such house was a small embassy of Britain in the wild American land. Jefferson, a self-taught architect who had absorbed his knowledge from books, hated this style. To him, it was the language of the oppressors, and he decided to answer, not with words, but with stone. He rejected London and turned his gaze to Rome, to neoclassicism, to the language of columns, porticos, and domes. This was not a matter of fashion. It was a political act. He was choosing the visual vocabulary of democracy and a republic to declare to the world, the British chapter of history is over. A new one is beginning, an American one, heir to the great Rome. Monticello is an argument aimed at Europe. The old world looked at America as a collection of uncouth farmers and savages. Jefferson built his house to prove them wrong. He wasn't building for his neighbors. He was building for ambassadors, philosophers, and aristocrats in Paris and London. Every perfectly calculated proportion, every quotation from ancient architecture screamed, "You think us barbarians? Look, here, on a mountaintop in the middle of a wild continent, we are creating a civilization more pure and rational than yours." And the crowning glory of this statement was the dome. The first dome on a residential home in America. It's not just a roof. It's a symbol of the celestial vault, an emblem of the universe. And by placing it over his dwelling, Jefferson was making an unprecedentedly bold statement. He was proclaiming his house, his little mountain, the center of a new world. Here, in his library, under the shadow of this dome, beats the heart of a new era. He designed his manifesto. He found the money for it. He made hundreds of hands raise it to the sky. He built a monument not to himself, but to an entire idea. But he failed to consider one thing. The most ruthless critic of his creation was himself. And soon, upon his return from Europe, he would look upon his nearly finished masterpiece and pronounce a death sentence upon it. Imagine a house that was built over years, a fortress of the mind, erected on a mountaintop, the first fruit of a genius the world had yet to recognize. By 1784, the first version of Monticello was almost finished. It was a building that, in itself, defied everything being built in America. It remembered the hands that molded its bricks and the sweat of those who raised its walls to the sky. It was ready, and at that moment, its creator leaves. 5 years in Paris, 5 years in the heart of an old civilization that he both despised and desperately wanted to surpass. He breathed the air of the Enlightenment, walked through halls where Rococo was giving way to stern neoclassicism, absorbing elegance, light, and sophistication. And then, in 1789, he returns. He ascends his mountain to look upon the work of his entire youth, and what he sees horrifies him. His house, his pride, now seems to him provincial, clumsy, too tall, too cramped, too American. In his eyes, burned by the brilliance of Paris, Monticello was not a temple of the new republic, but a monument to his own short-sightedness. It was not good enough, and therefore it had no right to exist. And so he gives an order that would shock any builder, any financier. Demolish it, not remodel, not expand. Demolish most of what had been built over years. The second story, gone. The staircases, walls, roof, all to the hammer. It was an act of inconceivable waste. It was architectural suicide, to be followed by a resurrection. It was an act less architectural than existential. He wasn't demolishing walls. He was erasing the old, naive version of himself, the man who had not yet seen Paris. For Jefferson, this was a necessary sacrifice on the altar of perfection. But this sacrifice was not made by him. The price of his new vision fell as an unbearable burden on the shoulders of those who had already built this house once. Now, they had to build it all over again. Decades of hard labor were wiped out by a single decision. The mountain that was almost conquered showed its teeth once more. Expenses doubled, debt soared to astronomical heights, and construction dragged on for another 20 years. Every strike of a hammer shattering a wall was another nail driven into the lid of his financial coffin. But he didn't care. He was obsessed. He was building his legacy, and it had to be flawless. He returned from Paris with new blueprints and a new vision. But the architectural plans were not the only thing he brought back across the Atlantic. In the shadow of his great ambitions, a secret was hiding. A secret forged in Paris that would forever change the hidden life of this house and define its true, untold story. Paris gave Jefferson a dome for his house, but it also took away his peace of mind. While the American ambassador spent his days absorbing architectural innovations and engaging in philosophical debates in salons, by night, a drama unfolded in his residence that would cast a shadow over his entire life. The main character of this drama was a 16-year-old girl. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was his property. She was his late wife's half-sister. And now, brought to Paris to look after his youngest daughter, she found herself in a paradoxical situation. According to French law, there was no slavery on this land. The moment she stepped onto French soil, Sally Hemings became a free woman. She could have left. She could have filed a petition, found a job, and stayed in a city where the color of her skin did not determine her fate. And she knew this. What happened behind the closed doors of the Parisian mansion on the Champs-Élysées, we will never know in detail. We can only reconstruct the bargain. On one side, a 16-year-old girl, tasting freedom for the first time. On the other, a 44-year-old widower, one of the most powerful men of his time. Her master. He, the author of the Declaration of Independence, was persuading her to renounce her freedom. He, who had proclaimed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was convincing her to return to Virginia, where the law made her a thing. And he made her an offer that could be called a deal with the devil. Return with me, become my secret companion, and I will grant freedom to our future children. Not to you, to your children, when they turn 21. This was a promise that violated every law and custom of his world. Freeing the children of an enslaved mother was an unheard of act. For Sally, it was an agonizing choice. Personal freedom here and now, in a foreign country, far from everyone she knew, or a return to slavery for the phantom chance of freedom for her future offspring. She accepted. In 1789, she boarded the ship with Jefferson. She was crossing the Atlantic no longer as a mere servant. She was returning to America, carrying his first child and his terrible secret. This Parisian bargain became the invisible foundation of the new Monticello. While workers were tearing down the old walls, Jefferson was building new, even higher ones, walls of silence around his personal life. From now on, his house would be not only a temple of the Enlightenment, but also a stage for a drama of lies, passion, and power. A drama that would last for the next 38 years, in which the children would be simultaneously his descendants and his property. There is a myth, the myth of the solitary genius who, by the force of his intellect, erected Monticello. We see his drawings, precise, elegant, full of complex calculations. We imagine him, like a deity, creating an architectural marvel with a single stroke of his pen. But a blueprint is not a house. An idea is not a wall. And while Thomas Jefferson was in his study, in a world of ideas and abstractions, down below, in the world of dust, sweat, and physical labor, his house was being built by others. They were not called architects. They were called property. They were carpenters, joiners, masons, blacksmiths, brickmakers, people whose hands turned a vision into reality. And among them, one family stood out, their fate inextricably linked with the fate of this house. The Hemings family. Sally's brother, John Hemings, was a genius of woodworking. Jefferson would give him his drawings, often inspired by the most complex examples of classical architecture, and John Hemings would find a way to bring them to life in Virginian oak and pine. The elegant cornices, the intricate parquet floors, the decorative friezes that are rousing admiration from experts today, all came from his hands. He was not merely an executor, he was a master craftsman. He read wood the way Jefferson read Plato. But after a long day's work, having created another masterpiece, he returned not to an elegant study, but to a slave's cabin. His skill, his intellect, his talent were a silent but devastating refutation of all of Jefferson's theories about the inferiority of the African race. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, the philosopher coldly pontificated on their inherent deficiencies, and at the very same time, the people he considered inferior beings were creating a beauty he himself could only imagine. This contradiction hung in the air of Monticello. It was in every perfectly fitted joint, in every panel polished to a shine. The house that was meant to be a symbol of reason and order was built on a foundation of absurdity. People deprived of basic rights were creating a monument to freedom. People whose very humanity was denied breathed a soul into this house with their art. Jefferson saw them as tools, talented, valuable, but tools nonetheless. He recorded in his books how much they were worth, how much they worked, how much they ate. But he could never have built this house without them. John Hemings and the other masters in chains were not just the builders of Monticello. They were its co-authors, unrecognized, forgotten, but co-authors nonetheless. And every time we admire the elegance of this house, we must remember that we are looking not only at the genius of one man, but at the silent triumph of many. A genius chose the place for his temple, a mountaintop. But the mountain was not going to surrender without a fight. The construction of Monticello wasn't just the erection of a building. It was a daily, grueling war against nature itself. And the soldiers in this war were enslaved people. Every element of this house is a story of overcoming. Let's start with the bricks. Hundreds of thousands of them. They weren't brought from afar. They were made right here, at the foot of the mountain. Clay was dug from the earth, mixed with water, molded by hand, and fired in kilns. This was hellish labor under the scorching Virginia sun. But making the brick was only half the battle. Now, it had to be brought to the top, to an elevation of 260 meters. There were no roads, only steep trails, washed out by the rain. Each brick was hauled up the mountain, either in carts pulled by exhausted oxen, or more often, simply in human hands. Imagine this endless chain of people, day after day, year after year, carrying on their shoulders the future walls of a home in which they would never be allowed to live as free people. And the timber? Massive beams of oak and pine, destined to become the floor joists and roof rafters. They were felled in forests miles away. Then they were dragged by oxen to the base of the mountain, and the hardest part began, the ascent. It was an operation that demanded not only inhuman strength, but also precision. One wrong move, and a multi-ton log would plummet down, maiming and killing. And water, the simplest, most essential element for life and construction. There were no springs on the mountaintop. Every drop of water needed to mix mortar, to drink, to cool the blacksmith's tools, had to be carried up in barrels from the valley floor. It was a Sisyphean task. The mountain demanded water, and the people had to quench its thirst. While up above, in his temporary dwelling, Thomas Jefferson studied the works of Palladio, consulted his blueprints, and wrote letters on the philosophy of liberty. A different reality was unfolding below. a reality of broken backs, hands rubbed raw, and a constant battle with gravity. The intellectual pursuits of the master of the house were directly proportional to the physical exhaustion of his slaves. The higher and more complex his architectural designs became, the harder their labor grew. The mountain did not submit to him. It was conquered for him. Every stone laid in the foundation, every beam raised to the roof, is not just a building material. It is crystallized human sweat. It is suffering made manifest. He saw the mountain as a pedestal for his genius. They saw it as their silent, merciless enemy, which they were ordered to conquer. Monticello is a grand theater. On its stage, a play called The Civilized Life was performed. Guests would arrive, admire the collection of artifacts, engage in refined dinner conversations, and listen to music. And everything happened as if by magic. Dishes appeared on the table, glasses were filled with wine, and dirty plates vanished. It seemed as though the house lived its own, autonomous life. But this was merely an illusion. And Jefferson, like a brilliant director, designed the very architecture to maintain this deceit. Behind the scenes of this theater, another world was hidden, a world of invisible labor, a world of enslaved people. And to make them invisible, Jefferson applied all his inventive genius. Look at the grand staircase, or rather, at its absence. In a traditional Virginia home, a massive staircase in the hall was the center of attention, a symbol of status. At Monticello, there is none. Instead, there are two narrow, steep, and hidden spiral staircases, each only 60 centimeters wide. They were concealed in side passageways. These were the arteries for the servants, channels through which the human machinery of the house could move without being seen by guests or the master. They were inconvenient and dangerous, but they served their main function, making the enslaved invisible. And here, the dining room, the heart of the theater. This is where Jefferson reached the pinnacle of his skill as an illusionist. A revolving door with shelves was built into the wall next to the fireplace. Dirty dishes were placed on a shelf on one side. The door was turned, and clean ones appeared on the other. No servants bustling back and forth. No extra eyes and ears during important political conversations. Another marvel, the wine lift. A small dumbwaiter that connected the dining room directly to the wine cellar. Jefferson only had to pull a rope, and as if by magic, the next bottle of French wine would appear from below the floor. This wasn't just a display of technical ingenuity. It was a way to eliminate the presence of the enslaved wine butler, a potential witness to candid conversations. But the most grandiose mechanism was hidden underfoot. Beneath the entire house and its wide terraces, Jefferson designed a whole network of underground passages and workshops. The kitchen, the smokehouse, the storerooms, the cellars, the entire life support heart of the house was hidden underground. There, in the semi-darkness and smoke, work was bustling. From there, through hidden passages, food was delivered to the table. All the noise, all the filth, all the hard labor was intentionally forced out of sight. Jefferson created a world that seemed to function on its own, by the power of pure reason. He built an architectural utopia, but the price of this utopia was high. To create the illusion of a world without slavery, he had to design the most perfect prison. A prison that erased from view not only the labor, but the people themselves, whose daily heroic effort made this illusion possible. While upstairs, in the elegant rooms of Monticello, the rights of man and the philosophy of Aristotle were being discussed. Downstairs, just a few hundred steps away on Mulberry Row, a machine was running. A cruel and efficient machine for turning human labor into cash. This was the nail factory, and it was a microcosm of the entire estate, its most frank and ruthless nerve center. Jefferson established it in the 1790s. This was not some primitive cottage industry. It was one of the plantation's most profitable enterprises, almost an industrial workshop. There was no room here for pastoral scenes of rural life. Here, the law of cold calculation reigned. The workers in this factory were not adult men. They were boys, children between the ages of 10 and 16. Their youth, their energy, was the raw material for this business. In the smoke and the din, they stood at forges, heating iron rods, and then with monotonous, practiced hammer blows, turned them into nails. Up to 10,000 nails a day. It was a system thought out to the smallest detail. Jefferson, a man obsessed with data collection, personally supervised every stage. Every evening, he would go down to Mulberry Row, but not to check on the working conditions. He went down to weigh each boy's daily output. Each one had his own quota, calculated with mathematical precision. And here, the philosophy of the Enlightenment gave way to the brutal reality of the plantation. If a boy failed to meet his quota, punishment awaited. First, the withholding of food. Then, a whipping. In his meticulous records, Jefferson praised those who exceeded their quota, promising them an extra portion of food or a new shirt. But he just as coldly recorded the infractions and punishments, a system of rewards and punishments designed by a philosopher for enslaved children. This is the most terrifying paradox of Monticello, concentrated into a single point: the intellectual ideal upstairs and the merciless exploitation downstairs. The profit from nails forged by children's fear went directly to financing the civilized life upstairs. It paid for the French wines, the exquisite delicacies, the books for the library, the scientific instruments. Every hammer blow below was an echo that resounded in the silence of the study above. Every red-hot iron rod was a link in the chain that bound the sublime world of ideas to the brutal reality of profit-making. The nail factory wasn't just a workshop. It was the engine that powered the illusion of Monticello, an engine fueled by the broken lives of children. In 1802, a bomb exploded. Not a real one, but a bombshell of information, and its fragments reached every corner of the young republic. A journalist named James Callender, a former ally turned enemy, published an article in the newspaper. The accusation was direct, crude, and unthinkable. He claimed that Thomas Jefferson, the sitting president of the United States, author of the Declaration of Independence, was keeping an enslaved woman as his concubine, a woman named Sally. The nation was in shock. For the president's supporters, it was vile slander, a political hit job. For his enemies, it was the long-awaited proof of his hypocrisy. The scandal raged. Newspapers reprinted the accusations, whispers filled drawing rooms, and Congress gloated. The entire country was discussing the secret life of the man who was the nation's moral compass. And what about Jefferson himself? How did the man whose greatest weapon had always been the word react to the most serious accusation of his life? He did nothing. He issued no denial. He did not sue for libel. He published no angry letter. He chose the most powerful and most ambiguous tactic of all: absolute, total silence. And his home, Monticello, became his greatest ally in this strategy. The mountain he had chosen to rise above the world now became his sanctuary, his fortress. He took cover behind the walls he himself had designed, walls that were built to conceal. The entire architecture of the house, created to make private life invisible, was now working at full capacity. Picture this. While the entire country is buzzing, discussing his alleged affair. He sits in his study, separated from his bedroom only by an alcove with a bed. And just a few steps away, in a room under the south wing, lives the woman whose name is on everyone's lips, Sally Hemings. She and their children, who are the spitting image of his late wife's relatives, are right there, inside the fortress. They are the living, breathing proof that he is hiding in plain sight. His silence was deafening. It was neither an admission nor a denial. It was a manifestation of absolute power. The power to decide what is public and what is private. The power to ignore a reality that was inconvenient for him. The man who had proclaimed the people's right to information now built a wall of silence around himself. Monticello was no longer just a house. It became the physical embodiment of his secret, a fortress where the master could live a double life, protected by the height of the mountain and the thickness of the brick walls. He had built his perfect stage, but now he was forced to become its prisoner, hoping the storm would pass and the world outside would never know what was truly happening behind his impeccable facade. From the outside, Monticello seemed to be the embodiment of order, harmony, and success. But behind that flawless neoclassical facade, a financial rot was festering. The splendor of the house, its endless renovations, its library, its wine cellar, all of it stood on a foundation not of stone, but of colossal, ever-growing debts. Jefferson was a genius in many things, but not in managing money. He inherited his father-in-law's debts, but instead of paying them off, he only multiplied them with the obsession of a collector. His perfectionism was a financial catastrophe. The decision to demolish and rebuild the nearly completed house doubled the budget and stretched the expenses over decades. Every new architectural idea brought back from Europe, every purchase, be it a book, a statue, or an exotic plant, was another step into a pit of debt. He lived as if his resources were infinite. His hospitality was legendary, but also ruinous. Dozens of guests could stay at Monticello for weeks, eating and drinking a fortune. The presidential salary, enormous for its time, slipped through his fingers like sand, going to pay interest to his creditors. And then, in 1819, the storm broke. A financial crisis, known as the Panic of 1819, shattered the nation's economy. The prices of land and tobacco plummeted. Creditors who had once gladly lent him money against his name now demanded repayment. Jefferson found himself on the brink of total bankruptcy. The man who had designed the nation's financial system could not manage his own, and he was forced to take a desperate, humiliating step. He decided to sell what was dearest to him, his very soul, embodied in his books. His library was not just a collection of volumes. It was the finest library in North America, 6,487 books, painstakingly selected over a lifetime. It was his brain, externalized, and he sold it to the United States Congress to pay off the most persistent creditors. This collection became the core of the future Library of Congress, a great gift to the nation, born of desperation. But even this sacrifice was not enough. The debts continued to mount. The house that was meant to be an eternal monument to his success and genius had become a giant weight around his neck. He had built his temple on a mountaintop, but a chasm of financial insolvency was opening up beneath him. Every nail, every brick, every column had been bought on credit. Monticello was not just a house. It was a magnificent, brilliantly designed monument to his own financial catastrophe. This house is not a static photograph. It is a slow, agonizing process. The construction of Monticello lasted for more than 40 years. 40 years, an entire human lifetime. This wasn't just construction. It was a war a war against money, against logistics, against nature. But his main battle was the war against time. Jefferson began designing the house as a young, ambitious man, full of faith that the world could be rebuilt according to the laws of reason. He finished it as an old man whose ideals had collided with harsh reality. And the house became a mirror of this struggle. He was constantly changing things. The blueprints were redrawn dozens of times. Walls erected yesterday could be torn down tomorrow because a new, more perfect idea had occurred to him. This obsession with detail turned the construction into an eternity. Materials became a battlefield. He would order copper for the roof, and it wouldn't arrive for months. He would demand special glass for the windows, and the ship carrying it would be caught in a storm. The most vivid symbol of this frustration is the famous dome. The heart of his architectural vision gaped open for years, covered by a crude tarp. He simply could not get glass of the right size and quality. His temple of reason, his symbol of the universe, leaked every time it rained. Time mercilessly exposed the chasm between his dream and reality. In his letters, he complained about negligent workers, slow suppliers, and a lack of funds. He, a man who believed in order and control, was a hostage to chaos, and he was getting older. His body was beginning to fail him while his dream house still stood in scaffolding. Monticello transformed from a project into an obsession. It devoured his energy, his fortune, and his years. He was building a monument to his immortality, but mortality reminded him of its presence every day. This eternal construction was a metaphor for his life. He tried to create a perfect republic, but it turned out to be full of compromises. He wrote about freedom, but he was surrounded by slavery. He designed a perfect house, but it refused to submit to his will. In 1809, after 40 years of struggle, he finally declared that the house was complete. But this was merely a formality. For him, Monticello was never finished. It was a living organism that he continued to change and refine until the very day he died. He won the war against the mountain, but he lost the war against time. He created his masterpiece, but the price he paid for it was far higher than he could have ever imagined. So, the house is finished. The curtain is raised. 40 years of construction are over. What was life like inside this architectural masterpiece? It was as dualistic and full of contradictions as its creator himself. On one hand, Monticello was a stage for triumph. It was the unofficial intellectual White House. Presidents dined at its table. James Madison, James Monroe. The revolutionary hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, stayed here. The air was filled with brilliant conversations in several languages, debates about politics, science, and philosophy. Music flowed like a river. Jefferson played the violin, his daughters and granddaughters, the harpsichord. The French wine he so loved was served with dishes prepared by chefs trained in Paris. It was the pinnacle of civilization, an island of the Enlightenment in the middle of the American wilderness. But as soon as the guests departed and the music faded, another reality emerged. A reality of deep personal tragedy and unspoken truths. Jefferson, surrounded by a crowd of grandchildren, was desperately lonely. He outlived his beloved wife and almost all of his children from that marriage. Of 6, only one daughter, Martha, survived to adulthood. The house, built for a large and happy family, became for him a mausoleum of memories. And in this very house, in the shadow of his official family, lived another. His Children by Sally Hemings. They were simultaneously his descendants and his property. They worked in the house, serving their half-sisters and nephews. Their light skin sometimes prompted awkward questions from guests. who mistook them for members of the white family. What was their life like? We can only guess at the daily tension, the awkward silences, the words that were never spoken. Sally Hemings, the mother of his children, never sat at the same table with him. She remained his slave, his maid, his invisible companion. He gave her children, but he could not give them his name. He promised them freedom, but he could not give them a father. Monticello was not a happy home. It was a gilded cage, filled with the ghosts of the past and the secrets of the present. The Temple of Reason turned out to be a house of unexpressed feelings. The Monument to Freedom was a place where everyone was unfree in their own way. Some, due to the chains on their feet. Others, due to the chains of duty and lies they had placed upon themselves. Life within its walls turned out to be far more complex and tragic than the magnificent facade had promised. The 4th of July, 1826. A great day. The nation is celebrating the 50th anniversary of its birth, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And on this very day, as if scripted by Providence itself, its author, Thomas Jefferson, dies in his home on the mountain. History had come full circle. The legacy he left on paper was immortal. The words about equality and freedom changed humanity forever. But the legacy he left in the accounting books was a catastrophe. His debt amounted to over $100,000. In today's money, that's millions. The ideal world of Monticello collapsed. The time for reckoning had come. A few months later, in January of 1827, on the lawn in front of the house he had so painstakingly built, an auction was held. But they weren't selling furniture or books. They were selling people. 130 men, women, and children, whom he sometimes referred to in his records as his family, were put up for sale like livestock. These were people whose ancestors had lived and died on this land for generations. People who had built this house, tilled its fields, cooked its food, and raised its grandchildren. Now, they were mercilessly sold off one by one to cover the debts for French wine and marble busts. Imagine the scene. An auctioneer shouting out names and prices. Husbands are torn from wives, mothers from children. Families that were once whole are shattered into pieces, sent to plantations across the South, never to see each other again. For them, it was the end of the world. In the history of the African American community, this day and others like it received a terrible name, the weeping time. They were sold to pay for the bricks of their prison. Their tears were meant to settle their master's debts. Of the more than 600 people Jefferson owned in his lifetime, he freed only a handful. In his will, only 5 were granted freedom, all members of the Hemings family, just as he had promised Sally decades ago in Paris. He did not free Sally herself. His daughter allowed her to leave, granting her an informal freedom. The hour of reckoning had arrived, and it exposed the cruelest truth about Monticello. The house built as a temple of liberty turned out to be paid for not just with slave labor. It was paid for with torn-apart families and human souls sold into slavery. The grand ideals remained on paper. In reality, the final act in the history of Jefferson's Monticello was the ruthless trafficking of human beings. After Jefferson's death, Monticello began to crumble. Sold for a paltry $7,000, the Temple of Reason was abandoned to the whims of nature and neglect. It seemed destined to become a picturesque ruin, a forgotten monument to a failed dream. But history had an ironic twist in store. The savior of Jefferson's legacy came in the form of a man Jefferson himself would have admired, yet whom many in Virginia despised. His name was Uriah Levy, a Commodore in the United States Navy. and he was Jewish. Levy saw in Jefferson the champion of religious freedom, who had fought for the rights of minorities like himself. He bought Monticello in 1834, not as a planter, but as a preservationist. He saw it as his sacred duty to protect this shrine to liberty. For nearly a century, longer than Jefferson himself had owned it, the Levy family cared for Monticello. They repaired the roof, restored the gardens, and saved the house from ruin, often facing bitter anti-Semitism from those who believed a non-Christian had no right to own a national sanctuary. Then, in the 20th century, the house became a museum, and for decades, the story it told was a carefully curated myth. Visitors heard about Jefferson the genius, the inventor, the statesman. Mulberry Row was just a manicured lawn. The enslaved families, the nail factory, Sally Hemings, they were ghosts, erased from the official narrative. The house was beautiful, but its soul was missing. Change came slowly, painfully. It came through the work of historians who dared to dig deeper. It came through archaeology, as the foundations of slave cabins were unearthed from beneath the perfect lawn. It came with a scientific breakthrough in 1998, a DNA test that confirmed with near certainty what had been whispered for 200 years. Thomas Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings's children. The myth shattered. The beautiful facade cracked wide open. And in 2018, a small, simple room in the south wing was restored and opened to the public. The room where Sally Hemings lived. A physical space was finally given to the woman who had been at the heart of Monticello's secret life. Today, the story of Monticello is still being written. Descendants of Jefferson's wife, Martha, and descendants of his enslaved partner, Sally Hemings, engage in difficult, often painful dialogues about their shared, tangled legacy. They meet on the grounds of this house, trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. Monticello survived, but it is no longer just a monument to one man. It has become something far more complex and far more important. It is a living memorial to America's original sin and its enduring ideals. It stands on its mountain, not as a perfect temple, but as a place of reckoning. A house that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our greatest triumphs are often built on our deepest failures, and that the price of liberty, for some, was the bondage of others. The story is now, finally, being told. All of it. In the end, Monticello is not just a house, but a dialogue between a dream and a crime, frozen in stone. Here, the shining facade of ideals is forever fused with the dark foundation upon which it was built, a reminder that humanity's greatest aspirations are sometimes inseparable from its greatest sins. Can we, while admiring the summit, allow ourselves to forget those left at its base? And what is a dream worth if its price is someone else's freedom? This story doesn't offer simple answers, but it demands a dialogue. Share your thoughts in the comments, because it is in such debates that understanding is born. If this conversation seems important to you, support us with a like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue it together.